we have a special occasion. Just now, we have a special occasion as we welcome Richard Reddie, to give a webinar for us. He's an old friend of Christians Aware. His title, I will read, Director of Justice and Inclusion at CTBI, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. Director of Justice and Inclusion. It's a very important post for our country and for the world, actually. Richard was born and brought up in Birmingham, and I read somewhere that you were passionately involved with slavery as a child and realized even when you were a child how evil slavery was. And my first encounter with your work was in 2007 when you were the director of Set All Free. And I remember walking through London with hundreds and hundreds of people. It was a very important occasion, and you managed it all. I remember that very well. It was the 200th anniversary of the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. And Richard is something of an expert in the field of slavery. He's written a book, The Struggle to Abolish Slavery. This is a recent book. And for that book, and it tells you something about Richard, he traveled all over the world to research the book, going to countries which had been slave-owning countries. I think that was a marvelous achievement. Richard came to York, and we have people here from York this evening to speak on slavery then and now. He also knows an awful lot about modern slavery last year, and we had a really good day then. As well as slavery, old and new, Richard's expertise covers migration, refugees, and racial justice. It's a huge area of work. We're privileged to welcome you tonight. Thank you. Richard's title is Love Thy Neighbour, Racial Justice in 2025. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. Just a point of clarification. I was actually born in Bradford, not Birmingham. Nothing against Birmingham. It's a lovely city. Actually, my brother lives in Birmingham. I'm actually a proud Yorkshireman.
Well, I'm glad of that. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm in Yorkshire.
Yeah. So yeah. So just to say, it's a pleasure and also an honor to be speaking with you this evening. And as you just pointed out, Barbara, the title of this talk is "Love Thy Neighbour: The Importance of Racial Justice in 2025." So what I'll do is I will speak for about 20 minutes, perhaps more. But I would also like to leave time for a conversation with you good folks. So if there's anything that I say that you perhaps want clarification on, or you've got a question about, happy to do that. So it won't be just me just sort of giving you a lecture and then that will be that. Hopefully we can sort of have an interactive dimension to this webinar this evening. So I'll start now. Love Thy Neighbour: The Importance of Racial Justice in 2025. Now, if you're like me and you're of a certain age, you may remember, or perhaps wish to forget, that there was a British situation comedy in the 1970s called Love Thy Neighbour. And for those of you who aren't of a certain age, I'll just give you a brief sort of synopsis in terms of what it was about. So it was about a white working class couple called the Booths who get upset when a black couple called the Reynolds move into the semi-detached house next door to them in leafy Twickenham. Now, although the show was actually called Love Thy Neighbour, there was actually very little love shown between the couples, particularly the two men, Eddie Booth and Bill Reynolds. And in all truth, the whole show was really one big excuse for swapping or exchanging racist epithets and sharing stereotypes, with the black man, Bill Reynolds, always getting the worst of it. Now, what's interesting is they don't show this program on television today. They don't even show it on one of those satellite channels that broadcast similar so-called comedies from that era, with warnings about language and attitudes that viewers may find unacceptable or offensive today. To me, that's how I would say racist the program was. But looking back on the show, it's kind of I struggle to really understand why this couple, particularly the men, did not get on. They spoke the same language, they shared the same politics, they had the same, I would say, cultural values. They probably had the same religious beliefs, largely Christian, yet they were shown to be at loggerheads solely because of their race. One person, one man was black and the other was white. And the writers were telling us that they could not or should not get along because of this difference. Now, this time last month, our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, suggested that Britain risked becoming an island of strangers because of immigration. Now, some welcomed this statement and the PM's speech in general. They welcomed it for its candor, but others denounced it as being misguided, unhelpful, and perhaps unbecoming of a prime minister, and particularly of the leader of a party supposedly on the side of the marginalized. And I think it's good that we're having this conversation in June. And I know that initially we were meant to have this webinar in May, but God, in his infinite wisdom, ensured that we're actually having it in this month. And I say all of this because June is a month that is filled with anniversaries and events that's speaking to issues around racial justice, immigration, sanctuary, as well as hospitality. So, for instance, Sunday, the 22nd of June, 2025, is what's known as Windrush Sunday. And Windrush Sunday is an opportunity for Britain in particular to publicly recognize and celebrate the humongous contributions of the Windrush generation. And the Windrush generation were the men and women who traveled to these shores from the Caribbean from the 1940s to the early 1970s. And, they've transformed Britain in so many positive ways. So, for those of you who are not familiar with this history, on the 22nd of June, 1948, less than 1,000 people who traveled from the Caribbean on the ship, the HMT Empire Windrush, arrived in Tilbury Docks in Essex. And for some people, this arrival heralded the rise of multi-ethnic Britain. And clearly, Britain has changed forever as a result of the movement of people from one place to another. But from a church perspective, Windrush Sunday is important because it enables us to acclaim the contributions of these courageous Christian men and women and how they've transformed the church in this country in so many positive ways. The Windrush generation traveled to the UK on British passports, and my parents were part of this. They were British citizens. They came to this country on British passports, and they believed they were coming here to help rebuild the country after the ravages of the Second World War. And with many of them, they were Christians. So folks tended to travel with a Bible in their suitcase, and in the Caribbean they call it a suitcase a grip. So they had in their grips Bible and hymnals, and this was something that meant a lot to them. And this Christian faith, I would argue, has helped to transform the spiritual climate of Britain and elsewhere. And as historians have pointed out that the birth and the development of Christian denominations that are now an integral part of the church firmament can be traced back, or can be traced rather, to the initial movement of these folk. Now, churches that were planted by the Windrush pioneers are actually one of the real success stories of Britain's Black communities, and they provide spiritual, social, and moral leadership, as well as assistance to swathes of communities and those in society. So, whether you go to church or not, many people still see the church as a place where they can get support, a place of succor, as well as salvation. And when not establishing their own churches, these trailblazers joined historic denominations and revitalized what were moribund congregations. And I'm a member of a denomination that has been wonderfully blessed by the presence of the Windrush generation and those who followed later. And when noting this achievement, it's important to give thanks to God. Give thanks to God for the way He has uh, helped our churches to grow because of the presence of these individuals. And, also these individuals establish what are known as Black majority churches. And some have pointed out that from little acorns, they have now become mighty oaks, possessing the confidence, the integrity, and the ability to take their places alongside their peers in historic denominations such as, the Catholic Church, the Church of England, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union of Great Britain, as well as to engage with authorities on matters affecting the communities that they represent. And I suppose for me, when I think of the Windrush generation, it sort of goes against some of the accusations and the discourse that some folk have made, and even what the Prime Minister has made in terms of these men somehow being complicit in Britain becoming an island of strangers. These individuals wanted to integrate. They wanted to be a part of Britain, and in fact, 2 years ago, when we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the HMT Windrush, King Charles III, no less, hosted a reception at Buckingham Palace in honor of the Windrush generation. And I don't know why, but for some reason I was actually invited to this gathering at Buckingham Palace. And, when you get an invite from the king, you don't really turn it down. So I put on my best suit and I bought myself a nice pair of shoes. Not really a good idea to actually try and wear in a new pair of shoes at Buckingham Palace. Quite painful, actually. All I can say is that it was a fantastic occasion. And I can tell you that champagne flowed like tap water at this function. Although I must confess that for some reason, I don't know why, I was actually abstaining from alcohol that month. But what was interesting was that the king had also commissioned a number of paintings of those who were part of the Windrush generation. And these paintings were actually on display at Buckingham Palace. And as the king and others noted, these Windrushers saw Britain as the mother country. They reckoned it was home. And when they came to Britain in the 1940s onwards, they believed they were coming home. And they were keen to be a part of British society. And this was despite the fact that, sadly, often these Caribbean men and women faced an often hostile environment. So, when I used to my mum's parish now, she sadly passed away 10 years ago. I remember talking to her about, what was life like when she first came to this country. And she said she arrived in, I think it was February. And she said the welcome was about as warm as the weather. Um, so many struggled to find jobs and housing due to racism, and they were subject to, sadly, racial violence at times. However, the truth of the matter is that Britain is now a more just and tolerant society, largely as a result of the efforts of the Windrush generation, as well as their white allies who helped to spearhead campaigns that fought against laws that were discriminatory in nature. And if you want to know more about the Windrush generation, there are resources that I've produced that are on the CTBI website, which can be accessed by typing in www.ctbi.org.uk. Now, June is also Sanctuary Sunday, and we similarly celebrate Sanctuary Sunday on the 22nd of June. And what's interesting about Sanctuary Sunday is that it actually ends Refugee Week. So Refugee Week runs from the 16th to the 22nd of June. And Sanctuary Sunday is an opportunity to reflect, pray, and commit ourselves as Christians to celebrate and continue to build hospitality and sanctuary for all, especially for those whose lives are most vulnerable and in danger. And Sanctuary Sunday is part of the Church of Sanctuary program. And Church of Sanctuary encourages churches in Britain and Ireland to meet and greet new arrivals fleeing from war and hunger. And this initiative has its roots in the City of Sanctuary movement, both of which were pioneered by Reverend Dr. Indigit Bogle. I'm sure many of you on this call do know Indigit. And, Church of Sanctuary calls on congregations to develop a welcoming, a hospitable, and an inclusive environment in which strangers feel genuinely wanted. And I work closely with Indigit on Church of Sanctuary. And Indigit himself is someone who comes from a refugee background. He was born in Kenya, but ended up, well, he and his family had to flee Kenya in the 1960s. So he's someone for whom, this is a very much a lived experience, and is keen for Christian communities to be equipped with the skills and the know-how to help those who require this assistance. And I think it's important for Christians to recognize that sanctuary or hospitality with safety, it's a long-standing theme in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And the foundation for this is found in the law books, of the Hebrew scriptures. And, Jesus actually echoes a lot of this in his teachings about how we treat the neighbor or our neighbor, as well as the outsider. And with this, with the apparent refugee crisis showing no signs of abating, I think the church community has to really put these scriptural imperatives into practice to help those who are also made in the image of God. Now, there's an old Celtic proverb which reads, "It is in the shelter of each other that the people live," and human warmth and welcome and friendship are the best form of sanctuary, and we can all be sanctuary to each other. Now, the children of Israel in the Hebrew Bible needed a constant reminder to love the stranger as yourself or as themselves. And this commandment is actually variously stated at least 36 times in the Bible. And it's something that I think as Christians we need to pay particular attention to. I don't need to tell you this, but back in 2012, the then conservative-led coalition government introduced what became known as the hostile environment, and this aimed to encourage those with no right to live in the UK to leave. But one of its unintended consequences, or some would say its intended consequences, was that it actually threatened those individuals who had a right to live here, particularly the Windrush generation, and it threatened many of them with deportation. And as a result, some lost their livelihoods and their health was affected because of this policy. And the hostile environment, I would argue, has been responsible for introducing and then promoting this notion of hostility into the immigration and asylum conversation. And it's now the situation that both asylum and immigration are toxic issues, and the discourse around them is characterized by vitriol and what I would say is a whole lot of ignorance. And I think that the challenge facing the church and Christians is how can we turn that hostility into hospitality? How can we adjust the dial so that the narrative is more positive and more affirming in terms of a message? Now, if you want to know more about the Church of Sanctuary, and particularly Sanctuary Sunday, again, please take a look at the CTBI website. Again, it's www.ctbi.org.uk, and there's resources there that churches can use to actually celebrate Sanctuary Sunday on the 22nd of June. Now, I spoke about love thy neighbour at the outset. And as you well know, this phrase or term is found in Luke 10. And as we all know, it's part of a parable that Jesus related. And we are told to love our neighbor. But the real question is the one that is asked by the lawyer, who is my neighbor? And in Jesus' parable, our neighbor is a person in trouble, the person in need, someone who needs our help. And at the heart of his parable is the importance of loving the stranger. And as some of you know, I'm the coordinator of the church's Refugee Network, or CRN for short, which encourages Christians to be more proactive on asylum and immigration matters. Now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Church's Refugee Network was one of those many organizations that was encouraging Britons to open their hearts and their homes to Ukrainian refugees, offering them sanctuary and a warm welcome. And I believe this was demonstrating the compassion that Jesus speaks about in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the importance of loving a stranger. But the sad truth is this, that we live in a world where the refugee situation in the Ukraine is really only the tip of an iceberg. According to the United Nations, there are over 120 million people who have been forced to leave their homes and homelands on account of war, persecution, the climate emergency, and poverty. So 120 million, that's roughly the population of Japan. And of 120 million, around 35 million of these are classed as refugees. So the question we need to ask ourselves is this, that, are those who we see in the media or on social media crossing the Mediterranean or in terms of closer to home, the English Channel, are they our neighbours? If so, how should we respond to them? Should we be like the Good Samaritan and how he responded to the injured man? Or should we be like the priest and the Levite who walked on by? Now, as Christians, I think we should be shrewd and streetwise, but these traits should not stop us from being compassionate and merciful, especially to those who need our help. My mum was, and I've spoken about her earlier, she was someone who I would call a common sense theologian. And she would often say that, sometimes the hardest decision or choice is often the right one to make. And when it comes to refugees or asylum seekers, what is harder or what's the hardest option for us to help those who are in need of our assistance or to turn our backs on them? One of my favorite verses in the Bible comes from Micah 6, verse 8, and it goes, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Now, we're often told that charity begins at home, and I think it does. It does begin at home, but it doesn't end there. And as we see in Jesus' parable, in terms of loving our neighbor could be the person next door, as well as the person in the next street, as well as the person in the next town, or even a person in the next country. Basically, the person in need of our help wherever they are. And the two greatest commandments are this: to love God and to love our neighbor. And we know that God loves our neighbors. He loved our neighbors so much that he sent his son Jesus to die for them, whether they know this or not. But what about us? I think there is a sad but incontrovertible nexus between immigration, asylum, race, and religion. Most of us who seek asylum tend to be black and brown folks who are not often Christians. And we saw this intersection last year where when we sadly experienced some of the worst race and religious related riots in decades on these shores. Now, many people were fearful, some were frantic, others were furious. And there were cases, sadly, of black and brown people being dragged out of their cars and beaten by mobs who were saying that they were taking their country back. And other protesters sought to set alight in one instance, set alight to accommodation housing asylum seekers while their compatriots appeared to egg them on. And, this hatred and violence took many people by surprise. And you could see this in a way a lot of folks struggled to respond to this, especially in the church. Now, the riots were the handiwork of the extreme right in British politics, who argue that immigration is the number one public policy because it threatens the identity, culture, and cohesion of this country. And that was constantly heard during the riots. And, for me, what was equally as worrying was the fact that many of these extremist actors were actually co-opting and then weaponizing Christian symbols to promote their divisive, hate-filled agenda. But I go back to my initial point with regard to the so-called sitcom Love, Thy Neighbour. Now, the fact is, the Reynolds family, the black family, wanted to integrate. If they didn't want to integrate, they would have bought a house in Brixton instead of Twickenham. So they clearly wanted to integrate with their white neighbours. From an identity perspective, they were, the couple was from Trinidad, but they saw themselves as being British Trinidadians. They were eager to be a part of this country, to be a part of the establishment, keen to do all of the things that people criticize immigrants of not doing. But I think when it comes to this whole conversation around immigration, I think the real problem is around racism and race relations problems. And I'll say a little more about that later. Now, last month, we marked the 5th anniversary of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. And this police-related death was seen as a kairos moment as we saw the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and protest marches and demonstrations. And interesting enough, new phrases entered our lexicon, such as unconscious bias, microaggressions, decolonizing empire, as statues and monuments were being toppled. And everyone appeared to be talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. And in the church, we witnessed the writing of reports, the establishment of commissions, committees, reviews as a way of tackling structural and systemic racism. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of all of this is yet to be seen. But what we do know is that since the arrival of Donald J. Trump in the United States in 2025 as the US president, everything has changed, and President Trump has actually rolled back EDI, or they call it DEI in America. I call it DIE because that's what it's spelled when it comes to issues around equality. It's the death of it, really, in terms of the policies and the procedures that he's really cast into the long grass. And Trump barely mentioned George Floyd's name on the 5th anniversary of his killing last week. And his idea of racial justice is to provide sanctuary to the white Afrikaners who were the architects of the racist apartheid system in South Africa. And they say that when the United States sneezes, we, as in the United Kingdom, catch the cold. And we're already seeing pushback and a rolling back of EDI related policies in this country. And the question is, how should we, as people of good conscience, respond to this? So in conclusion, I would say that we are living in very important times. Now, some would say they're worrying times. Others would say they are awash with hope. And I think as Christians, we should always have hope, and our hope should be in Jesus Christ. Um, I would say, the times are worrying, but, also we need to have hope. However, I believe that we need to be a part of a movement for change that changes, among other things, the narrative about the movement of people to these shores. Now, the Windrush generation blazed a trail that has been followed by others from various parts of the world, and Britain is now a veritable microcosm of the world in an island. And like anything, such a coming together is not without its challenges. But to suggest that migrants and not racism is the cause of this problem, I believe is dishonest and naive, to say the least. The first thing about being a neighbor is that, you should seek to welcome the newcomer who comes into your presence. But as we know, sometimes neighbors, for a variety of reasons, are not that friendly. I always believe that you reach out to your new neighbors, you offer them friendship. Now, the onus is on the one already living there. However, if people choose to behave strangely towards those who are newcomers, don't be surprised if we all end up as strangers. So for me, this is a time for building bridges, for reaching out, for carrying out work that seeks to unite us, that seeks to bring us together, that encourages us to stand together rather than do activities or carry out activities that create division and seek to sow or foster hatred. And I think racial justice is important because at the core of it is work to reconcile us, A, to God, but to one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. I'll end it there. Thank you.